Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Carolina's Weather Group, and as you can see, it's very slim pickings tonight. I'm meteorologist Scotty Powell here, and very happy to have our guest on tonight, Holly Bailey, and she's going to be talking to us a little bit about her new book that just was released last month, Mercy of the Sky, and kind of her account of what she found out after doing some investigative reporting and kind of just reliving what happened in Moore, Oklahoma during the 2013 tornado. And you're probably wondering why Scotty the only one there. We have three of our guests on vacation this week. With the summertime, it's always a busy month. So some of our guys are out on vacation. We got some guys covering severe weather coverage tonight. And Ricky was supposed to be on tonight. It's just going to be Ricky and I. And his internet's out. So hopefully we can get that issue worked out before the end of the show. But if not, Ricky will not be with us tonight. So he's having some connector issues with his router, so I hope he gets that fixed up. But for all those who are tuned in tonight, we appreciate you tuning in. Just to kind of give you a couple of housekeeping rules. This is our live broadcast. We do have a Q&A session, question and answer. If you have any questions for our guest Holly tonight, feel free to send them that way, or else you can tweet them to us or Facebook. I'll try to monitor all of them. I normally have Joey doing that, but he's out of town this week, so we'll be trying to monitor in all the social media accounts if you have any questions for Holly. And if not, we'll give out her Twitter handle at the end of the show. And if you want to, you can tweet those to her as well. So the heat wave continues here in the Carolinas and Virginia and Tennessee. So not much weather-wise to talk about. So we're going to get right into our guest because Holly's had a busy day. She's up in Boston this afternoon and this evening covering some trials for her job, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll start off with that, Holly. You're a national correspondent for Yahoo News, and you're also a author to the Mercy of the Sky. Kind of, first of all, welcome to the show, but kind of tell us a little bit about you before we go into talking about your book.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, like you mentioned, I'm a national correspondent for Yahoo News. I'm actually speaking to you guys from Boston tonight. I was covering the sentencing hearing for Jahar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. It's actually sort of interesting. There's been two stories that have sort of dominated my job for the last 2 years. It was the Boston Marathon bombing that happened in April 2013, and then a few weeks later, the Moore tornado, which happened, I guess, about a month later, actually. And so I've been really covering both of the stories for the last 2 years, and wrote a book about one and sort of winding down the other now.
So Holly, I imagine you have a lot of frequent flyer miles between going to Oklahoma and Boston.
A little bit. I might have a nice vacation coming up on hotel points.
as well as going around and promoting your book. So I imagine you're looking forward to kind of taking a break and getting away from some things.
A little bit, but I'm going to Texas on vacation in a few weeks, and it's really not going to be much of a vacation. I'll be working there, and I'm hearing it might be stormy weather there still. So
yeah, man, they've really got it down there in Texas and Oklahoma with a lot of flooding now. We normally think of tornadoes in that area, but a lot of flooding taking place. Well, Holly, we're here tonight to talk about Mercy of the Sky, and I just wanted you to kind of tell us about what inspired you to write the book.
Well, I'm from Oklahoma. I grew up in Oklahoma City, and I went to school in Moore, Oklahoma for pretty much half my life. And when I moved to the East Coast, I was covering politics, but every now and then, every spring, a big storm would come, and usually a tornado. And a lot of people around me would say, well, why do people live in Oklahoma when there's such terrible storms every spring and such terrible tornadoes? Why would people put themselves in harm's way? And I would always find myself in this way of explaining of how when you grow up there, your relationship with weather is much different than in other parts of the country. You sort of grow up with the storms and, sort of admiring the storms and admiring the sky the way that, that it looks before a storm, and sort of living, knowing that, late in the day or something, a dangerous storm might happen, you might have to take cover. It's just sort of average part of life. But that all sort of changed in 2013. I was actually in my office in New York and having this exact conversation as we were looking at the television and seeing a tornado drop down in Moore, Oklahoma. And I was telling people, this looks exactly like a tornado that happened in 1989. And then I explained that another tornado had hit, many other tornadoes had hit Moore. It just was this really unlucky town. And so I ended up going back to cover the May 20th, 2013 storm. And I used to cover the White House for Newsweek magazine, and I had covered lots of disasters. I had covered Hurricane Katrina with President Bush, and so those things were sort of in my mind. I'd seen disaster before, but it's very different when you go back and it's your hometown and it's the streets that you used to drive down on when you were a kid. And so when I was there, I really wasn't thinking, oh, I want to write a book about this, but there was sort of, stuff coming out about the heroism, and plus just, the incredible way that local meteorologists there cover storms. I've always been interested in it. When I was at Newsweek, I always tried to pitch that as a story, and it never went anywhere. And so I ended up using part of that in my book, just a story of weather there.
It is. It's such an amazing place. I was out there in February, and it was my first time out there. And we traveled out to, we traveled to Moore and looked at where the tornadoes come through. And you can still tell today some of the scarring in the trees, and people still rebuilding back from 2013. And 1 month to the day that we were there was the tornado that touched down in March, just kind of touched down. So Moore is synonymous with tornadoes. I believe some of the research I've done, I think there's been like 18 tornadoes in the past 10 years that's went through the city limits there. So and with that being your hometown, what were some of the memories growing up there in Moore? I mean, with tornadoes coming through, was you ever scared, or are you more kind of just curious to see them, or tell us a little bit about that?
Well, essentially, whenever I was a kid growing up in Oklahoma, there were storms, but there were not storms like there are today. There were not mile-wide tornadoes with 200-mile-per-hour winds. It was just nothing like that. I remember when I was a kid, the most dangerous storm I can remember was this 1986 tornado that hit Edmond, Oklahoma, which is north of Oklahoma City. And to me, I thought that was the most terrifying tornado ever. And then I actually went back in the process of writing this book and looked to see how big it was. And it was like 200 yards wide or something. And no one died, thank God. But it was at a time when there was not a lot of advance warning. And so people could very well have died. And there were some houses that were destroyed and so on. But I mean, the storms back then were not like they are today, it's very strange. And then, when I was doing the research for this book, I kept asking meteorologists, why are the tornadoes so much bigger now? And, many people pointed out the fact that we just, we think of tornadoes and we think we know so much about them, but really we don't know. We have very limited records that really go back to the 1950s. And so we don't really know how big certain storms were before this. But whenever I was a kid, they were not like this. And I was obsessed with tornadoes, and at one point I wanted to be Gary England, who was the most famous meteorologist in Oklahoma when I was a kid, and actually retired in 2013 after the Moore tornado. But I feel like, and I shouldn't even joke about it, but I tried to see tornadoes and I tried to storm chase when I was a kid, but I never could see one, and it seemed like it would always hit after I left, and so I feel like something about me deters them. I don't know. It's very strange.
They may want you to move back to Moore. I mean, you never know. Speaking of Gary England, I got to meet Gary out in Oklahoma City back in February. Fantastic guy. And I actually want to talk to you a little bit about him later on. But a little bit ago, you touched on the tornado, the EF5 tornado that touched down in 1999 and Moore. That's kind of what got everybody's attention was. That's the first tornado that had wall-to-wall coverage. Talk to us a little bit about that and how that inspired you with writing the book.
Well, I've always, talked to people that are not from Oklahoma about the weather culture in Oklahoma, and that really is getting into not just people's relationship with the weather, but how TV stations cover weather there. It's unlike anywhere else. I mean, they have helicopters that they scramble into the sky and they chase tornadoes that way. And I've likened it to sort of the way Los Angeles covers car chases. I mean, it is very, very similar. And in fact, one of the helicopter pilots who works for Channel 9 in Oklahoma City, the thing he was famous for before he came back to Oklahoma, he's a native, was that he filmed the slow white Bronco chase that O.J. Simpson, carried on, in 1994. And so to go from chasing OJ to chasing tornadoes is quite something. But, it's the things that they've done in Oklahoma in terms of just coverage. I mean, Gary England, which we'll talk about later, I mean, he really was one of the first people to get Doppler radar for a television station. And then sort of the competition between him and the other stations just sort of fueled this like intense way of covering weather. And in some ways people poke fun of it and say it's way over the top, but at the same time, it really does save lives. People really pay attention to the television stations there. And if they didn't, many more people would be dying from these storms every year.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely want to talk about the whole Oklahoma City media and how they go about storms. But in your book, you kind of tell a story or a perspective of different people. So I've got three people that I've written down. Rick Smith, a good friend of ours and a good friend of mine. You got to kind of interview him and kind of hang out with him. Talk to us about that day, May the 20th, and what he was experiencing and his flashbacks of that moment when the tornado took place and more.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I do in the book is I sort of tell the perspective of that day tell the story of that day through various perspectives, whether it's Rick Smith at the National Weather Service, whether it's Gary England and the other local meteorologists, whether it's the people in Moore who know a storm is coming. I just wanted to get all those different perspectives in the book, and I use it as a way to not just tell the story of that day, but tell the whole story of Moore and weather. And Rick Smith was a major resource for me. He's so great and is such an important person in terms of really informing people now, about storms. It's interesting to see how much social media plays into storm alerts now. And Rick Smith, that is his forte down in Oklahoma every spring. He mans the Twitter feed for the National Weather Service down there. But I really wanted to I used him to sort of tell the story about meteorologists that work for the National Weather Service and how they have to sort of keep their cool while issuing warnings, while they are often many times in the path of these really dangerous storms. And in fact, the night before the May 20th, 2013 storm in Moore, there was a tornado that took aim right at the National Weather Service down there in Norman, and they had to stay calm and on air in front of their computers, telling people what to do while even they were in the path of these storms. And even this past spring, and this is sort of an update on the book, Norman and Moore were just hit again and again by really bad storms in the past few weeks. And Rick actually had some of his windows blown out at some point by hail, and still he was working. And that just sort of tells you the dedication that people have in terms of trying to keep people safe in Oklahoma and elsewhere.
Yeah, I know people outside of the Oklahoma City area don't realize just how integral Rick Smith is. He is the man, he is the man there, and he works through it. And they're there 18, 24 hours a day covering these storms, and he does such a great job. And for that, Rick's going to be coming on the show next month and kind of talk about his job there at the National Weather Service and what his duties are. So we're looking forward to that. So to our viewers, that's something else to be looking forward to towards next month. We turn to Damon Lane. Damon's a little bit about Damon. He actually graduated here in North Carolina from UNC Asheville, so it kind of ties to our area. Damon's been on our show a couple of times and a good friend. Talk to us a little bit about his perspective, what you found out from Damon, because he was a little bit closer than what some other people were to the tornado.
Definitely. Well, I go into the story of the three major meteorologists in Oklahoma City, which Gary England, Mike Morgan, and Damon Lane, who 2013 was his first storm season as the chief meteorologist at KOCO. But he had a different type of story in that he actually lives in Moore, Oklahoma. His house is right off Southwest 4th Street. And he moved there knowing that Moore is, sort of the epicenter for these terrible storms, but really never imagining what it might be like if you were on air and something were to happen. And so that day, in fact, his wife was racing home to try to get in the shelter and get their dogs in the shelter. And he was on air and talking about, not just that the storm was heading towards Moore, was heading towards his hometown. And you can see on radar, it's heading right towards his house. And I have a website for my book, mercyofthesky.com, and I have links to all the coverage of that day. And I really suggest people go back and watch Damon's coverage that day, because it is miraculous. I don't know how he kept his cool, but he did. And even knowing, worrying about his wife, not knowing if his house was destroyed, because he could see it on radar. It was going right towards his house. And at one point, one of the storm chasers at KOCO tells him, I think that your house got hit. And he still just remains so cool and so calm and collected. And it's just really, really incredible.
It is the story of his wife getting to the house, and I believe you said in your book the power was going out, and there was just a small opening in the garage door. So very close, and like you said, he just remains calm on television. And I love Damon, and actually I love all the Gary England as well. They kind of give you pep talks during the storm and to their followers. And I told Gary a couple of weeks back when we had him on the show, I was like, if I lived there, I would be. I believe in you, man. I would be there, and I would know that we're going to be okay. Kind of talk about that, because a lot of people here in the Carolinas and the Southeast in general, we don't see these big wedge tornadoes that are out in Oklahoma, and they're not as covered as well as what they do in Oklahoma. Kind of talk to us about how the meteorologists get on TV and kind of talk people through these storms.
Yeah, well, it's sort of funny because this also didn't happen really when I was a kid, but as the storms have gotten bigger and bigger, the coverage, they started hours ahead of time sometimes, whenever there's not even a tornado on the ground. If they know that the conditions are ripe, they'll get on air and immediately start covering a storm. And, one thing that's really interesting is that people do rely on the meteorologist as not just, someone that's going to tell them when a storm is coming, but someone that can reassure them that they're going to make it through. And, Gary England, I remember when I was a kid, there was many times he would be like, okay, just go to the center of your house, get in your bathtub, take your tornado precautions, very, very calm. And people come to rely on people that way. And it's not just him now. I mean, Gary England and Mike Morgan and Damon that day, at one point they would just, pause and we're going to make it through this. This is going to be okay. But I mean, sometimes, it does take someone to say, take me seriously. And Mike Morgan at one point, was telling people and more, if you're not out of the way of the storm, I mean, you've got to listen to me. This is really serious. And that's something that people also in Oklahoma kind of worried about. They worry about because the coverage of storms is so, just wall to wall. Sometimes they worry that people get desensitized about this sort of thing. And so it's, they take this role of just this sort of larger than life person, there to protect people and get them through these tough times. And, I think it's very different. Actually, in Boston yesterday, there was a tornado here or south of here. And it was interesting sort of watching the weather coverage. It's quite different. And then, anywhere else as well, because here they don't even have tornado sirens. And, so it was just very quite different. And, they didn't have pictures or anything. And they were just really relying on people, don't hurt yourself. But if you have a picture, please tweet it at us. I mean, it was sort of interesting. So
that is very interesting. We'll talk a little bit about that. The next guy and the last one that I kind of picked out is Stephen O'Eddy, the city manager there for Oklahoma. And I mean, out of everybody, Stephen's been through ground zero numerous times, starting with the 99 tornado and even up till, a couple weeks ago. Talk to us a little bit, or talk to what you found out from him and how he's he's beaten by storms here left and right, but how he maintains and keeps on leading the city.
Well, he is the city manager of Moore, as you mentioned. He has been the person that has been one to sort of lead rebuilding every single time that the city's been hit by a storm. And his first big storm was in '99, and he talked to me about going out there and just looking at the devastation, and it was like the apocalypse. I mean, every house is destroyed in every direction, and he really wondered, is Moore going to recover from this? But they did. And sadly, through every storm, they've gotten better and better about rebuilding really quickly, getting the debris out of the way. They know exactly what to do, and that's sort of a sad thing because they would prefer not to have those skills, but they do. But it's incredibly stressful because they have to figure out when to sound the storm sirens, and they worry about people getting out of the way. And it's sort of the same kind of stress that meteorologists feel. They worry about people listening to them and taking their advice and that sort of thing. And so while you have people on TV, telling people to take cover, you have people like Steve Eddy getting ready and sort of trying to position people to sort of do rescue and recovery and that sort of thing. And so it's quite stressful. But he is sort of the person that he feels like it's his job to, as soon as the storm passes, immediately just start trying to get things as back to normal as quickly as possible so that they can rebuild quickly.
And they all three of these guys do this, and with Damon, of course, but with Rick and Steve, this is battening down on their hometown, or their home area. And so the way that they conduct yourself when tragedy is just right outside the door is very commendable for them. Let's kind of switch to the TV media side. I know we talk a little bit about, and we will talk a little bit about the coverage of that day, but you, through your book, you did some research throughout the time period of Oklahoma City weather coverage and media in general. Tell us how it started out and where it's got to today.
Well, basically, weather coverage was weather coverage is obviously happening around the country, but this is, the really big advances in coverage really started happening in Oklahoma City. It started with Gary England procuring a Doppler radar for a commercial television station. He was the first to use it to, cast a tornado warning. And he has really been this person that has viewed his job as more than just a TV meteorologist. He sort of views his job as a scientist in some ways, and sort of trying to elevate the coverage to protect people. And these people at the stations, a lot of people say, well, it's all about ratings, and perhaps that is some of it. But I really think that the stations in Oklahoma City also view it as about a public service, especially in the state that keeps getting hit again and again by dangerous storms. But everything that you see basically about weather coverage was born in Oklahoma, from the little, beeping map on the side of your television screen that doesn't interrupt your television shows. Gary England and Mike Morgan sort of advanced that. The storm chasing was really elevated in Oklahoma. You had people, they had sat phones, military-style sat phones, just sort of captured tornadoes live. And then you have the helicopters, which actually started way back in the 80s, though they didn't really start to use them until the late 90s. And that really came to fruition with the 99 tornado, which they tracked with a helicopter from the moment it started until its end, which is about an hour. And so that was just completely on live television, and really the first storm that people watched that way and saw it coming for quite some time.
And I don't know if this is a good comparison or not, but to me, it reminds me of covering an actual sporting event. It's just, you have play-by-play commentary, you have your reporters out in the field and in the helicopters, and it's honestly, it's an artwork with producers and the way that the meteorologists all work together. And some of that is also a downside. I know not the Moore tornado, but a tornado that affected the area just a week later, the El Reno tornado. There's a couple of storm chasers that for Gary England almost got too close to the storm.
Yeah, a lot of people, and not even just Channel 9, and Channel 4, their storm chasers. That was a really different storm, and a lot of people, there was actually, I would recommend, National Geographic did an incredible cover story on Tim Samaras, and who was killed in that storm. But one of the things that they did that was really incredible was this multimedia presentation that sort of showed how that storm did wild things, how it changed direction and basically became so large. It was wider than the island of Manhattan, which I live in New York, and that's just incredible to even imagine. It just basically, people described it as a tornado that seemed destined, and at least determined to kill storm chasers, and it almost did. Some people lost their lives, but many more could have. But in the coverage of that, Gary England at one point was yelling at his people on the ground, "You're too close, you're too close." And so there is this sort of really competitive nature to it, and that's some of the reason that Gary England later, he retired, and part of that was he cited the stress of just worrying about his own staff. He felt like they were taking too many risks.
And you're talking about the competitive nature of the spotters out in the field, but even with some of the on-staff or on-air meteorologists between the competing stations, I know Mr. England and Mr. Morgan don't always see eye to eye with things, and that didn't recently happen. That's been something that you found out through your studies. It's been there a while.
Yeah, I mean, there was the competition between the stations in Oklahoma City. I mean, it is fierce. It is like, I would, compare it to the big rivalry is OU, University of Oklahoma versus Texas. I mean, it is more intense than that in Oklahoma City in terms of wanting to be first to see a storm and trying to be the best and first and highest in the ratings in some ways. But, for Gary England and Mike Morgan, it seemed quite personal for sometimes. Gary England thought that Mike Morgan was, perhaps shooting his mouth off a bit too much, a bit too brash. And Mike Morgan thought that he wasn't getting some of the credit for some of the innovations that he was introducing into the market. And so there was that tension there. But, what's sort of funny is that I write this in the book, is that for all the ways that they kind of dislike each other personally, they actually have quite a bit in common. And sort of the competition that they had really fueled them to be better, and thus for elevated the coverage in Oklahoma and made it really good. And so that sort of competition in the end was quite good for viewers, I think. If not, they'll never be best friends or anything. So
Yeah, I don't think they'll ever go out to a local establishment and have a drink or anything together.
No. And there's a funny scene in the book. Rick Mitchell, he used to work at Channel 5 in Oklahoma City, KOCO. Damon Lane replaced him. He's now based in Dallas. And I interviewed him just about what it's like to sort of be this third person in the middle of the Gary England, Mike Morgan competition. And he spoke about how, there was the movie Twister was filmed in Oklahoma. And for some reason, it was a big deal about who got a cameo and who didn't. And Gary England has a big cameo at the beginning of that movie where he is projected saving Helen Hunt's character as she's a kid. And then Mike Morgan only had sort of a passing bit part, and then Mitchell had another sort of more significant part. And he talked about sort of watching them at the premiere and the hurt feelings over who had more. And that was the fun part to write, just sort of the competition there. But like I said, it's sort of fun to laugh at that, but in the end, sort of the rivalry between those two really made Oklahoma City coverage so much better.
It has. I mean, being there in February, it's kind of and I don't live there, just kind of outside viewer, but it's either watch Channel 4 or Channel 9, KOCO, kind of third place, but it really has bolstered the way that severe weather coverage is. And I believe, and I'll ask you this in a little bit, but I believe it's saved several thousands of lives, throughout the duration of storms. So one thing I want to ask you, and I know that you were able to sit with Damon and with Gary and Mike, kind of break down their performance. Did one do something better than the other? Kind of what did you learn on how all three of those guys approached that day?
Well, I mean, it was sort of, I think for Damon, obviously I read a lot about how he kept his cool while that storm was going toward his house. And that was quite unique, and nobody else can really even say that. But for Gary and Mike, that day, I mean, they both performed their different roles. I mean, Gary England really feels like his role is to be very calm on air and not freak out his viewers. And he criticizes Mike Morgan for getting really passionate. But Mike Morgan gets passionate because he worries about people not listening to him. And so you sort of see the different styles there. And like I said, all the videos are on my website. And if you're a junkie, you should totally go back and watch them because they're pretty incredible. I mean, all of them did amazing, incredible work that day. And, it's 25 people were killed by the Reno tornado, and so a few hundred were injured, but so many more. It's sad to have loss of life, but so many more people would have died had it not been for these television stations and just the way that they just did the coverage that day. It was really incredible.
You're talking about being a junkie. Sometimes when the weather's calm and I have a quiet moment at the desk while I'm eating lunch, I'll pop on YouTube and just look at it, because I love to watch their coverage because I hope to learn some ins and outs of it. So for anyone who's I know we have a lot of college guys who are in the meteorology programs throughout the country watching. Get on there and watch those videos because it's really neat to see how they're able to communicate, and you may pick up a few things. Talking about that, how did the locals perceive the coverage of that day? Was it all good? Was there any negative, or what did you find out through this?
It was generally, for the Moore tornado, it was generally positive. There was some issues with the Reno tornado a week later. People in Oklahoma were obviously still pretty jittery after the Moore tornado and fearful. And then this giant El Reno tornado forms, and people, they had been saying that that would be a dangerous weather day, and so there were some people that were critical of some of the coverage that day, specifically Mike Morgan, who he at one point was telling people to drive out of the way of the storm, but little did he know that all the roads were clogged, and also the tornado just did that crazy thing where it changed direction so many times. So there was a lot of criticism lobbed towards him. But it was interesting to sort of watch. I think that there was a lot of lessons learned from all of that. If you watched any of the coverage of the last 2 years. Now, in 2014, the strange thing that happened about 2013 is these two crazy storms happened, and it was this wild weather year. But then the next year, it was the quietest tornado season in Oklahoma, in history in Oklahoma, since they've been really keeping records in the 1950s. But then this year was crazy active again. I believe one of the stats that Rick Smith was tweeting out was there's 81 tornado warnings alone in Cleveland County, which is where Moore is. And I was back there doing some book stuff and obviously watching on television. And I actually watched a lot of coverage when I was here in Boston, here covering the bombing trial. I would watch it because it was crazy, being here and still watching the storms is sort of what I always did. But you could tell that, there was a lot more considered, especially with Mike Morgan. He was a lot calmer and a lot, you could tell, I think, that he learned some lessons from those 2013 storms.
It is. I know he kind of was raked over the coals for some of the things that he said. So I know that's a sensitive subject for him, and I know he's made a few appearances kind of defending what he said. So, in the heat of the moment, you just want to get people safe. And sometimes what you say isn't always the best. But like you said, I believe he has learned from that. So we can only tell in the future when more storms appear. One thing that I haven't really dug into, and I don't know how much you've dug into this, but how does social media play a factor in these tornadoes? Now we can get on Twitter or Facebook, and you have anybody that can tweet out a picture or a graphic of the National Weather Service or Storm Prediction Center graphics and stuff like this. But how was social media perceived during this event?
Well, this was one of the, I think, and you would probably know more about this than me, but I think in Oklahoma, in terms of tornadoes, this is the first big social media tornado. Rick Smith at that time was, as he is now, he was running the Twitter for the National Weather Service, and he was sort of all day saying this is going to be bad, tweeting out maps and warning people and warning parents, that maybe you want to think about what you're going to do with your kids because some of these storms might touch down before the end of the school day, which is very rare in Oklahoma. And unfortunately it did, and wiped out 2 schools, and 7 little kids died at one of the schools. But, it's interesting when I was in, I do write a lot about the social media aspect in the book, but one of the things that I think is quite interesting just moving forward is actually when I was in Oklahoma this last time, I met a woman who told me that she found out that a tornado was coming because she looked on Instagram. And I was like, you saw it on Instagram? And she said, yeah, someone posted a video and hashtagged it. The hashtag for Oklahoma weather is OKWX. And so she was following that on Instagram. And it was the first time that I'd ever heard of someone hearing about a tornado on Instagram. And she said she grabbed her kids and ran to the shelter because that was the March tornado where tornado sirens hadn't gone off yet because they didn't see a storm coming, and it just kind of happened out of nowhere. And so I think, that's really interesting because there is this concern about people tuning out from local TV, and how do you reach these people that do? And because there are a lot of people, surprisingly, even in Oklahoma, that don't have television. And so you see a lot of the stations having social media apps and so forth, but Twitter goes crazy during storms now. And you see people talking about, they'll tag stuff, and this is what's happening on my street. And it's quite incredible. But the trick is to sort of weed out that information to where it's credible, not scaring people. And I think sometimes that can be overwhelming, especially as people, sort of take more to this.
Yeah, definitely. Social media is not as filtered as TV would be. So there's some things that do need to be weeded out. One other thing I want to kind of ask you, the people in Oklahoma does almost everyone have weather radios, or is that kind of a thing of the past? I know here in the Carolinas and in the Southeast in general, there's not many weather radios in people's homes. And is that different culture there in Oklahoma, since you guys are more synonymous with storms?
I think people have more weather radios now than they did in 2013, just like they have more storm shelters now than they did in 2013, which is crazy to believe. I mean, but one of the big stories, and even shocked me, is I thought that after the 1999 storm that hit more, that people that rebuilt would automatically have storm shelters. But surprisingly, many people didn't. In these neighborhoods, especially, there's some neighborhoods that had been hit again and again, and they still didn't have shelters, and that's unbelievable to me. But that has really changed since 2013. People have radios, they have shelters. There's actually a sad epidemic right now in Oklahoma where a lot of people in their haste to try to get shelters in 2013 built shelters that weren't really built well, and so during the wet weather they rose out of the ground and they're going to have to get new ones. And but I think while people were aware of the weather and sort of storm aware and aware to take care of themselves and always keep a wary eye to the sky, there's things that they've done now that have they're taking the weather way more seriously than before.
I was going to ask you that. You would say Oklahoma citizens are very weather aware, probably more aware than anyone else in the country.
Yeah, I think so a little bit. I mean, I just remember my mom whenever I was a kid. I mean, when you're a kid, you sort of are raised to regard weather as this just sort of thing, that's in your life, and you have to sort of be wary of it. But I mean, there is this sort of fascination. It's hard not to see the beauty in the sky when you see storms rising up in the west. And I remember my grandmother and I would sit out on the porch and watch them come right at us. And I think, but at the same time, there is this sort of, danger about that because, people do get caught up and they want to get close and they want to see these things, not really realizing, how big they can be, really how big they can go really quickly and how quickly they can change directions and so forth. And sort of, unfortunately, I mean, there's, when storms happen, it's kind of a traffic jam in Oklahoma in some ways. And that's why you see some of the scientists like Howard Bluestein at the University of Oklahoma, he doesn't even like chasing in the city anymore and what he does is try to, travel around with his equipment and take x-rays of tornadoes. But it's impossible for him to do it in sort of an urban area anymore because of the traffic of the amateur storm chasers, of people that want to see storms, and not to mention all the TV people who are out.
I was going to say, if a lot of people in the weather community, weather enterprise, they have a radar scope on their phones and it has storm tags, and you can tag yourself where you're at location wise. And in the plains, you always see all these red dots with storm chasers out there, and it does get congested.
Like a video game.
It does. It really does. And it gets so congested. Then you have to think about some of those roads are dirt roads, and are they muddy? Are you able to get through them? It's a very dangerous situation to be out there because if you don't know what you're doing, it can sneak up on you pretty fast.
Yeah, very much. And I remember after the 2013 storm, I went and just did the public tour of the National Weather Service down in Norman, which is one of the most popular tourist attractions in Oklahoma. I mean, mind you, that sort of explains sort of the fascination with weather there. But I remember the first thing that happened is it was a meteorology student from the University of Oklahoma who was leading the tour. And the first thing that happened is this guy on the tour was like, I'm going to be a storm chaser. I know how to do this. I watch it on TV. I can do it. And like, he just badgered the guy the entire time. I can do this. How do I do this? How do I become a storm chaser for the National Weather Service? And it just sort of, so many people want to do that. They see it on the Weather Channel or reality shows, and they just really want to do it.
Yeah, and it's very, very difficult. You have to know what you're doing because ultimately your life's in danger doing that. So we were talking a little bit about storm shelters. Here in the Southeast, many people are not familiar with those. Can you kind of enlighten us what you learned about those, and even how neighbors are helping other neighbors during stormy days?
Yeah, well, in Oklahoma, the ground is very shallow, so a lot of houses don't have basements because they flood. And so the traditional storm shelter that most people have is just sort of this underground kind of tube thing that's what many of my neighbors had when I was a kid. And, you know, it's just sort of in the backyard and so on. But now, as with these storms of getting bigger, you know, there's been such advancements in the way these things are built. People have safe rooms in their house that, you know, allegedly can, you know, withstand, you know, a car being blown into one of these things. But, you know, and more, again, just to go back to what I was saying before, a lot of people didn't have shelters after the 99 storm, which is kind of surprising. And also another thing is that they didn't have storm shelters at a lot of the schools, largely because no one ever expected a storm to hit during the middle of the day as this one did. And so there's a big push now in Oklahoma, which is controversial because they've been wanting to install storm shelters at schools, but some people don't want to do that because it'll cost so much money. And so this is really emotional debate and so on. But in more, they've rebuilt the two schools that were destroyed by that tornado with storm shelters. Another school was destroyed by a tornado this spring. They're going to rebuild it with a storm shelter, and they're trying to figure out a way to install storm shelters at all the schools, not only just to protect the kids, but also to serve as sort of this community shelter for people.
Yeah, and right now there is no community shelters. You know, you have to know a neighbor or a friend that will let you come in those. But I do like the push of having those general areas. Again, I kind of see the backlog in it. You don't want anybody out there as the tornado's rolling through, but you know, it is a good idea to have a centralized location where people can come in. For those who are less fortunate and not able to afford those storm shelters, they could go to somewhere that's safe because they're not too cheap.
No, they're not. I have a friend, my best friend just moved to Denton, Texas, which has been skirted by many tornadoes in the week since she's bought her house. And they are looking at a storm shelter, and it's around $4,000 to $5,000, which is quite a bit of money. Quite a bit of money.
It is. We're closing in on 8:40. A couple more questions here for Holly Bailey is our guest tonight. She is the author of Mercy of the Sky, talking about the Moore Oklahoma tornado that came through in 2013. And one thing that you kind of talked to in your book was about the schools, and we were just discussing that. Talk about, you know, the differences in Plaza Towers and Briarwood. One of the schools, like you said, 7 students did pass away, and kind of talk about the heroics of that day in those schools.
Well, all day, the schools had known that it was going to be bad weather. There had been terrible storms the night before, and so many of the teachers and principals with the school system woke up that day knowing, you know, because of the National Weather Service, because of Rick Smith and the television stations, that it was going to be likely a bad weather day. And some parents, in fact, came and checked their kids out way early. But there were obviously many kids left, and so as these storms started moving through, you know, nobody ever really thought, okay, a storm's going to hit in the middle of the day. It was just so unusual. And there's one of my characters is Amy Simpson, who in fact grew up in Moore, and she talked to me about, you know, when she was a kid, everyone sort of had the same routine. You would go and practice your tornado precautions. You would go into the hallways and kneel down and lean against the wall and cover your head. And that was just sort of, you know, how they did it. And people always practiced it, but they never thought they would for once ever have to really do it in real life. And so, you know, this storm developed around 2 o'clock. It started heading their way, and, you know, parents started running in, grabbing their kids, but many people stayed there with the kids, the teachers, and so on. And they went to the only place they could, which was those hallways. And Briarwood Elementary took a direct hit from the storm, but miraculously, no one was killed. You know, there's a scene in the book where I have one of the administrators from Moore Public Schools. He arrives on the scene. He thinks his kid, who is at another school in the west at the time, her school might have been hit. And he learns as they arrive that she's in fact safe. But he arrives at Briarwood and he sees it, and he's thinking, you know, there's no way people are alive here. But he was climbing through the rubble, and it was dark, and he recalled, you know, shining his cell phone light, and he saw some glinting, and he realized that it was his cell phone lights, you know, sort of shining on the kids' teeth, and they were smiling at him. And he said it was like the most amazing moment, that he remembers, just seeing those kids alive. But a few blocks away, Plaza Towers also took a direct hit. And unfortunately, 7 third graders died. And there were a lot of teachers who were severely injured. But just the story of the teachers just doing anything they could to protect the students. There was a teacher that had a car fall on top of her, and she just protected. She bore the weight of that car, and the kids underneath her had barely scratches. And so it's just, stories of miracles that day. And you have to imagine, most people, it's just, if you step back and you think, okay, who survives an EF5 tornado, a mile wide, 200 mile per hour? I mean, they could hear it coming for minutes and minutes. And as it approached the school, it seemed to slow down and just procured their agony. And they could smell the earth as it was stirred. It smelled like dirt and grass and lumber. It was just terrifying. And it seemed to be over the school forever. But, many people miraculously walked away.
It is. It's amazing that there was not more tragedy than there was. The 7 lives are horrible, but that could have been much more disastrous turnout than what happened. We're speaking of the schools. There's now debate in Oklahoma, and I've even heard it here in the Southeast. Should we close schools for severe weather days? Should we keep them open? What have you learned about that process in Oklahoma throughout writing your book?
Well, there's a couple of strains of thought. I mean, many people, one of the things that I noticed that's different, and I went back and I wrote an update on More for Yahoo a couple of weeks after the book came out, just talking about sort of the differences in the mood and More, and people are still on edge. I mean, after 2014, which is a really quiet year, to have such a fierce storm season this year, and they were hit again and again. They had, storm warnings. They had tornado sirens going off at night. They had tornado sirens going off at 7 in the morning. I mean, it was just seemed to be nonstop for them. And, people in that town sort of just closing stuff down. They didn't even want to be open. They wanted to be home near their shelters and so on. But yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, there is this debate about, should we close schools when it's projected to be a storm day? But in Oklahoma, if you did that, you would simply never have school in May. I mean, it's storms are such a regular occurrence. But a lot of people say, More has been sort of reflexible about this. They've said, they've allowed parents to check out their kids early or so on. But many people are against closing the schools because, sometimes there's no place for kids to go. Parents are at work, and it's better for them to at least be in these schools with other adults who are trying to look out for them, as opposed to being home alone. And who knows if they're watching television or so on when these storms roll through.
You're right, Holly. A couple of years back, we actually had a tornado that moved through my hometown. And the biggest story and there's numerous stories, an EF3 tornado moved through. But the story that stuck with me was the 11-year-old boy who was home alone and how he just clutched to the kitchen table and hid under it as his house was hit by the tornado. And hearing the story of him crawling through the yard to get up to his grandparents' home, I couldn't imagine, a 3rd or 4th grader being home by themselves with a tornado ravaging through their house. And I know it's a controversial move, but I do believe the kids are safer in the school building where they do have adults looking out them and looking out for their best interests, because sometimes kids are off playing in their own little world and they're not really paying attention. So I know it is a very controversial issue, but I do believe keeping the schools open is a good option.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're talking finishing up. We talked about the schools and the TV media and just the storm shelters. Is there any other things that kind of stick out to you as you walk through the streets of More the days after the tornado that kind of stick with you to this day? I mean, I know you've seen all kinds of tragedy and all kinds of sights, but is there anything in particular, any few things that still stick to you today?
Well, I think I think many people that observe tornadoes would agree with this. It's just the strangeness of tornadoes and what they do and what they don't do. And, and More, and we see it with storms all the time. You would see a house completely blown apart on one side of the street, across the street, a house that seemed windblown and covered by mud, but still standing. And how did that happen? I mean, and there were strange things, whenever I got there that day. I mean, one of the first things I did is I drove through this neighborhood, and there was a house that was entirely demolished except for the closet, and the clothes were still hanging there and looked just normal. And the only ways you could really tell, aside from the house around it being gone, that anything had happened was just a little bit of spot of mud on one of the sleeves of a shirt. And then, there was down the road, there was a bowling alley completely demolished, but in the middle of it, a lane where the bowling pins were still standing, ready for someone to bowl a strike. And it's just bizarre. And, it just sort of speaks to the mystery. I mean, Howard Bluestein describes tornadoes as sort of the last bit of science that we don't understand. And it's absolutely true. I mean, as much as we see tornadoes, every tornado, it seems, is captured on video now. There's still so much mystery about why they do what they do, and how they touch things and don't touch things. And, it's just totally fascinating. And, we still haven't solved any of that.
That's it. That is like the one science that we still are learning day after day. Every time a tornado happens, we can learn something from it. Talking of tornadoes, a week later, the El Reno tornado came, and we talked a little bit about it before, but the TV media side. But this town had been ravaged through the EF5 tornado more. What were the people thinking when El Reno happened?
Not again. I can't believe it's happening again. And, it's this sort of is the feeling and more. It's a lot of people say, okay, well, they describe more as the tornado alley of Tornado Alley, and because it's been so unlucky with the storms, and every time they wonder, why us? And is there something special about our land that makes these storms hit us? And tornado scientists say no, it's just bad luck. And Steve Eddy, who we talked about earlier, even, he talked to me about how he quizzed people. There's just still they can't believe it's going to happen. But still people move back and they cross their fingers and hope against hope in some ways that this is not going to happen to us again. How could it hit this neighborhood again? But in March, that tornado, even though it was small and not even comparable really to the other storms that have moved through, it hit a block north of where the other storm had hit. It knocked down these iconic radio towers and more, the KOMA towers that had been skirted by the 2013 tornado, and this time it took them down. And so it's just this reminder of, it's weariness of, why us again? Why is it hitting us again?
It is. I was watching KOCO, the coverage back in March, and the helicopters see it before the warning's out, and the warning takes a couple of minutes before they issue it. But you look, and like you say, in the towers and the gas station and just that strip of land that had just been hit by a tornado not 2 years ago, and then you have this. It's a crazy environment there of how storms just feed off of that area. And that kind of leads me to my second to last question is, people say, why don't you move away from Oklahoma? Why don't you move away from that area? I know why Oklahoma is awesome. I fell in love with Oklahoma when I visited. But tell us, why is Oklahoma? Why do people not move away from there?
Well, part of it is that many of these people in Moore, and you bring up the El Reno tornado, and some of the people that had been in Moore and evacuated, they had actually moved to another part of town and were in danger again from that El Reno tornado. And I remember talking to a woman who lived across the street from Plaza Towers, and she said that was really, it hit home for me that, anywhere I go, something like this could happen. A natural disaster could happen. And in Moore and in larger Oklahoma, they basically say, okay, well, we're not any different, by choosing to stay and rebuild than people in California who live in earthquake zones and rebuild, or people in North Carolina who live, near hurricanes, where hurricanes hit and they rebuild, or so on. They really feel that this is, something like bad can happen to them anywhere, and they don't want Mother Nature to sort of drive them out of their homes. And I think in the book, I sort of related back, there's this mentality, I think, of dating back to the Dust Bowl, the other major, natural disaster that hit Oklahoma in the 1930s. Many people talked about the people that fled Oklahoma to California, the farmers, to make a better life. But there are many people in Oklahoma who stayed and endured, and that they wore that as a badge of honor. They stood up against Mother Nature. And in some ways, it's very similar to the way people in Oklahoma feel about tornadoes. They don't want Mother Nature to sort of take away their lives, their homes, and where they want to live. They love Oklahoma. And so I think, that's a large reason of why people stay.
And I know from being there, you ask them and they're like, well, if it happens, we'll just rebuild. We've done it before, and if we have to do it again, we'll do it again. And I think that's a good attitude to have. They don't get scared away. They're just like, well, if it happens, we'll pick up the pieces and we'll rebuild. So a great attitude. And my last question for you, Holly, is this: what have you learned about weather throughout this whole process? I know you said you loved weather growing up as a kid, but as you've met with Gary England and Damon Lane and Mike Morgan and Rick Smith, what have you learned, and what do you consider yourself like a weather savvy now, that you can kind of, if your friends come up to you and say, Holly, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think you feel comfortable enough? Or just tell us a little bit of what you've learned about weather.
Well, I wouldn't consider myself like that, but I mean, I think I live around people that live in New York and have never experienced storms. So I think I'm a little bit more savvy than some of them. But I guess, one of the biggest revelations for me in writing the book was just to go back to the meteorologists. I think they are such heroes and so amazing. And one of the things I think I knew on a sort of a basic level, but I didn't really know on a gut level, is just how emotional and how taxing it can be, and how worrisome it can be for these people in this position. I mean, Gary England agonizes, and Mike Morgan agonizes, and Damon Lane agonizes over people and keeping them safe. And there's a scene, I opened up the book actually talking about Gary England, and if you watched him on television, he was always sort of this happy-go-lucky sort of great guy. And I mean, on storm season, he was very serious, but otherwise he's very jokey and this very light presence. But what he never told people was just how agonized he was after the 1999 tornado when people died. He couldn't understand, could he have done something else? Could he have saved more people's lives? And he went back and viewed autopsy reports trying to figure out how people died so that he could tell people, do this, don't do this. And, just taking it to that sort of emotional gut level and being haunted by this, the idea of losing people and the burden of that responsibility. It's a lot. And I think I knew that, but, it's stressful being on television and worrying about people. And they really do. It goes back to what I said earlier. I mean, some of it is about ratings. There's no question. But people in Oklahoma who are in the weather view it as a public service. They really want to keep people safe. It's something that they really want to do.
It is, and it's some days there's 2-3 day outbreaks, and they're there with minimum sleep. So I commend everyone out there in the Oklahoma City and Tulsa and Wichita and the whole Midwest. They really have it in from April to early June. It's just an active time for those guys. And Holly, the very last thing, you made an appearance on Weather Brains, and James Spann gave you the daunting task of educating the media, especially there in New York, about weather and how it is such it can be such a hindrance on people and cause devastation to them. How's that went along? Have you been able to do that? Or I know you've been busy with the Boston trials, but do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as an world and letting?
I mean,
this does affect people.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to sort of explain weather and sort of explain what it's like and have people care more about storms. And I actually wrote a piece about meteorologists and valuing them and not making fun of them for the Washington Post recently, which I was really proud of. And so that's, I guess, sort of part of what I've been up to. So.
I know that was kind of a trick question, but that's something I wanted to, because like you said, in Boston and New York, you don't get tornadoes or you don't get real severe weather. So it's a different animal up there, at least, with storm coverage.
Very, very, very different.
Well, Holly, I appreciate it. I'm going to let you get off. I know you've had a long and busy day, and we're coming up on the 9 o'clock hour. Before I let you go, though, I'd love for you to promote your Twitter handle and website, and definitely tell us how we can get your book.
Well, my Twitter handle is HollyBDC, and my book is called The Mercy of the Sky. I have a website for it, mercyofthesky.com. I also have a Tumblr page, hollybailey.tumblr.com. So, and you can buy my book on Amazon, but if you go to the book website, there's all kinds of links for other stores as well. So.
Awesome. Well, Holly, thank you so much. We appreciate you coming on. I know it's been a busy couple of days for you, and go get you some rest.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, Holly. We appreciate it. Have a great night.
Thanks.
All right, guys. Well, we're going to wrap it up, and we appreciate Holly coming on tonight. Very interesting, and I urge you, if you've not got to read her book, you need to. It's a great book and a great read, and I think you'll learn a lot and have a lot of respect for not only the on-air meteorologists, but the meteorologists at the National Weather Service and many others. And very great read. And it's something I suggest everyone, especially in the weather enterprise, if you're into weather at all, you need to take a look at that. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about next week. We're going to have Rob Eichler on, and hopefully Nick Kozer from Fox Charlotte outside of that. I'm sorry, excuse me. After that, we have the Myrtle Beach tornado that happened back in 2001, July the 7th. We're going to talk about that with Ed Piotrowski, who is the meteorologist, chief meteorologist in Myrtle Beach for the CBS affiliate, as well as Stephen Paff, who is the warning coordinator meteorologist for the National Weather Service in Wilmington. So looking forward to those two shows. And again, thank you for watching tonight. We hope you have a great night, and we'll see you next week.